Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. All participants are in a listen-only mode. You have the opportunity to ask questions from our panelists and to raise any technical issues you may be experiencing by using the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. Please note that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording and slides will be made available on the NILC website, NILC's Facebook page, and emailed to all registrants. It is now my pleasure to turn today's program over to Avideh Moussavian, Legislative Director at the National Immigration Law Center.
Thanks so much, Ignacia. Thanks to everyone for joining us today, and welcome to the National Immigration Law Center's webinar entitled Equal Opportunities to Thrive, covering rebates, tax, social security number, ITIN filers, food security, and access to food programs. We've got a packed agenda today. We've got a lot of folks on the line, and we're very excited to share this information and also hear from all of you what's been on your mind, and hopefully the material will be a helpful start in answering some of those questions. Next slide, please. As Ignacia mentioned, my name is Avideh Moussavian. I'm the Legislative Director at the National Immigration Law Center. And joining us today as presenters are my colleague at NILC, Jackie Vimo. She's the Economic Justice Policy Analyst in our office. And we're also excited to be joined by Sara Cullinane, who's the Director of Make the Road, New Jersey, and Gabriela Ibañez Guzmán, who's a staff attorney at Somos and Pueblo, Unido in New Mexico. Next slide, please. And I should add, if folks are experiencing a little bit of a lull in the transition to slides, that's normal. You're not alone. It's just partly due to the high volume of folks that we've got on the line, which is great, but it just might mean we ask your patience as the slides transition. So for today's agenda, I just want to quickly provide an overview of what we're going to be covering. So this is an outline of what we're going to be discussing today. As evidenced in the title, we're going to talk about the COVID-19 relief packages and zeroing in specifically on how the cash rebate works, how it impacts tax filers with social security numbers versus individual taxpayer identification numbers. We're going to review food security and access to food programs under the relief bills. And we're also going to hear about exciting and innovative ways that states have started to think about how to address filling in the gaps that are left behind, though we continue to fight for closing those gaps at the federal level, but how states are taking action, and in particular from our colleagues from New Jersey and New Mexico. And then finally, we're going to conclude in terms of the presentation with an overview of what's happening next at the federal level, what we can expect in the coming weeks from Congress, and we'll include resources for folks and also make sure to save at least 10 minutes at the end of this webinar to answer any questions. Before we go into the actual presentations, I just want to review some quick housekeeping rules. First of all, participants on the webinar are all on mute, but we encourage you to ask questions, and you can use the chat box, the questions box located on the right side of your screen to enter a question at any time. We may not get to it till the end, but feel free to put it in the queue so we can start setting up how to field those questions to our presenters and use the Q&A time most efficiently. Also, if you are experiencing any technical difficulties during the webinar, including hearing any of us speak, please also feel free to use the questions box for that. And my colleague Ignacia will be responsive and try to resolve the problem as quickly as possible. Finally, I'll just note that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording and slides are going to be shared to anyone who registered by email for this. So if you know anyone who was hoping to join but wasn't able to, we will still be sending them the information and the recording for them to use and for you all to use and share as you like. Next slide, please. Great. Before we dig in, I just wanted to provide a brief overview about NILC. So National Immigration Law Center has been around since 1979, and our mission has always been focused on defending and advancing the rights of immigrants with low income. We have a vision of removing barriers to equity, and opportunity, and belonging, and making sure that those barriers are dismantled for all of us so we can achieve our full potential. We want a country that really has a vision of dismantling economic and racial justice barriers as part of that. And in terms of how we sort of see our theory of change in advancing these different policies is both using narrative and culture change. So we incorporate narrative and culture change goals in our work to shift public perceptions about the role of immigrants and immigration laws and policies in our country. We tap into policy advocacy and litigation expertise as also part of the tools in our toolbox. And finally, we focus on building movement power so that we can really enhance and boost grassroots groups' capacity so that we can leverage our collective power to really advance transformational change at all levels. So with that, I'm going to ask for the next slide, please. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jackie Vimo at NILC, Economic Justice Policy Analyst at the National Immigration Law Center. Jackie, pass the mic to you.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about, just so folks know, the benefits that were under the CARES Act. And I'm going to talk specifically about the economic impact payments, and I'm going to talk a little bit about access to food and nutrition. So basically, the two major pieces that I'm going to focus on here are, and we are in this mode now, again, are this economic impact payment, and there's a lot of complexities to it because it, is really unnecessarily complicated. So I'm going to try and keep it pretty top line. But I wanted to just sort of start with, but although there's a lot of details, but just sort of talking about immigrant taxpayers, right? I think the first thing that I just really want to emphasize is that all wage earners, regardless of their immigration status, are required to pay federal taxes. And I'm going to talk a little bit about ITIN filers in a second who were cut out of the bill. But in 2015, which is the last tax year we have on information we have about ITIN filers, they paid $23.6 billion in total federal taxes, and that's over $5.5 billion in payroll and Medicare taxes. And when we talk about these issues, undocumented immigrants and ITIN filers, they're not the same thing. They support programs like Medicare and Social Security number, but don't receive benefits. They don't get to have access to Medicare and Social Security. So it's really, they're lifting these programs up. It's also important to know that ITIN filers pay all kinds of other taxes. When I go into the store and I purchase something, I don't go up to the store and you're not able to say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to pay sales tax on that because I don't have a Social Security number. So I think that's just an important framing. In terms of what an individual taxpayer identification number is, since '96, the IRS has issued ITINs, our individual taxpayer identification numbers, to taxpayers and to their dependents who are not eligible to obtain a Social Security number. And the purpose of this is to allow them to pay taxes. An ITIN always is going to begin with the number 9. It does not provide work authorization or provide eligibility for Social Security benefits, even though, it's often traded for a Social Security number. And this is another huge piece, and I'm going to get back to this various times during the presentation, which is once you have been issued a Social Security number, even if you were filing with an ITIN before, that Social Security number is yours for the rest of your life, and you are no longer allowed to use your ITIN. So if you ever at one point had work authorization or issued a social, that's yours for life. You cannot go back to using the ITIN. Again, as a reminder also that ITIN holders are not all undocumented individuals. You can get an ITIN if you're required to file a tax return. If, for example, your spouse or if you're dependent of someone who is a U.S. citizen or a green card holder who got a work visa for themselves, but did not come with a spousal work visa and so forth, and a few other, types of immigration statuses. So whenever we talk about ITIN, that's not synonymous by the way, with undocumented. Also important to note that, because this is also a lot about tax filers, and they're going to use a lot of data from tax filing as part of the eligibility for the CARES Act payments, that we do have really strong confidentiality provisions under IRS law. We are not aware of ever there having been a breach of IRS sharing tax data with immigration agencies. There have been some reports lately about sort of private data brokers sharing ITIN numbers for immigration enforcement, but all of the, there's a New York Times story about this. I've talked to the reporter. None of this has been confirmed, and we have no evidence of data sharing. So another just sort of quick thing is that, again, people who have DACA, who have Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival status, or if you have TPS, Temporary Protected Status, many of those people might have lost work authorization, already. But if they did lose work authorization and they have a Social Security number, that remains the number that they have to use to file taxes. So even if your employment authorization document has expired, you should continue to file taxes using the SSN you were issued. Okay, that was just a background, but now let's talk about the recovery checks that everyone wants to know about. So in terms of the economic impact payments, which is what they're calling them, and also important to know that this stuff is a moving target, that these things are changing by the day, including about an hour ago, we got new information and I had to change, some of parts of this presentation. Again, so who is eligible for the CARES Act economic impact payment? So one is you have to have a valid Social Security number. So you cannot have an ITIN, unfortunately. Someone just asked if that someone has work authorization, is that different than an ITIN? It is. Work authorization, once you have work authorization, if you've ever had it, you will have a Social Security number for the rest of your life. So just to be clear there. You cannot be claimed as a dependent of another, and you have to have adjusted gross income under certain limits. So basically, those are the big requirements. You have to not make too much money, and you have to not be a dependent, and you have to have a social. One of the things that's been a little bit confusing to folks is that in the bill, it says that you have to be a U.S. citizen or a resident alien. This is not resident alien in the context of immigration law, so that does not mean you're an LPR, or a legal permanent resident, a green card holder. It means resident alien for tax purposes. So tax purposes, all that word means is that you live in the United States and that you're not a U.S. citizen or a green card holder. So if you lived in this country this year, you haven't been out of the country, that means you're pretty much a resident alien for tax purposes. So basically the CARES Act economic impact payment is basically an advanced rebate on your 2020 tax returns. And so when people talk about what is this, this is again a payment that is is supposed to be in advance for what they're anticipating is going to be the economic pain you're going to be feeling in 2020. So the maximum rebate amount is $1,200 for individuals, $2,400 for taxpayers who are filing jointly, and $500 for qualifying child. There are some limits there. So the rebate is reduced by 5%, or about $5 of the taxpayer's adjusted gross income. And that's, you can look on your last taxes to find out what that is. For every $100 above the following thresholds. So $150,000 for joint returns, $112,500 for head of household, and $75,000 for individuals, or those other than those two listed above. In any event, that is sort of the income caps. So on drilling down a little bit into the Social Security number requirement. So as I mentioned earlier, individual filers and couples filing jointly must have been issued a Social Security number that is valid for employment by the time they file their qualifying return. So that means, that if you do not have a social right now, you cannot receive this payment. And if you do not have a social by the time you file your taxes, if you did get a social by the time you filed your 2020 returns, and we can talk about that a little bit later, you will be able to be eligible in the future. But again, you have to have that Social Security number. So there's an exception, which is for there's at least one spouse who is filing jointly who has a Social Security number, and at least one spouse who was in the armed forces in the last tax year. So they basically cut out, they recognized, unfortunately, this is very unfortunate because it means that if you're in a mixed status family, you're being punished simply because your spouse, the person that you love, doesn't have a Social Security number. And even though you're a U.S. citizen or a green card holder or otherwise eligible, you're not going to be able to get your economic impact payment if you file jointly with your spouse. But they did want to recognize that a lot of people who are in the armed service are married to spouses who don't have Social Security numbers, so they made an exception just for that population. Again, only if they served in the last year, so this doesn't help vets or the millions of other people who don't happen to be in the armed forces, but who are in mixed status relationships where one person is a U.S. citizen or otherwise has a Social Security number. So as I mentioned, there are income caps. So the long story short, again, is that there are Social Security number requirements and income caps. And people are going to want to know exactly how these economic impact payments are going to be issued. In most cases, for most people, if you file taxes or if you receive certain benefits, the rebate is issued automatically. So most people, I know I got mine yesterday, have already received their rebates if they got direct deposit. If you do not receive direct deposit for your tax rebates, you are going to be receiving a check. Now, payments. So as I mentioned earlier, this is something that is based on it's a prediction of your 2020 tax returns. So they're going to be based on your last tax return filed in either fiscal year 18 or fiscal year 19. So if you have not filed, like I have not yet, your 2019 taxes yet, and as folks remember, the deadline for both paying your taxes federally and filing them got extended to July 15th. So you don't have to do it yet. So if you haven't filed for 19, they'll actually look back at your fiscal year 18 taxes. And they'll look at based on your earnings, your Social Security number status, and the number of eligible child dependents on all these returns. So the other question is, well, what happens if I'm a non-filer? What if I did not file my taxes? However, I do receive Social Security retirement or Social Security disability insurance, railroad retirement benefits, or supplemental security income, SSI. You will also receive your rebate automatically. Now, this is a thing that is very much moving. Folks might remember that 2 Fridays ago, the IRS under Mnuchin said that people who received Social Security were going to have to file taxes. And then about 3 hours later, after collective outrage, changed the guidance. And then we just found out that if you look on the IRS Twitter, that about 3 hours ago, they announced that now also people who receive supplemental security income or SSI also do not have to file. So things are, changing very quickly, and I would recommend going to the IRS Twitter website to keep up to date. Of course, there are lots of other people who maybe don't file taxes who receive Medicaid or SNAP but make too little to actually file taxes, and so they have to follow a different process. Those are people who are who are otherwise eligible but did not have to file taxes because they had a gross income that did not exceed $12,200 or $24,400 for married couples for 2019. And if you were otherwise not required to file an income tax return and don't plan to. So those people have to go to the portal. The portal for non-filers is irs.gov/EIP, so Economic Impact Payment. And this portal is for anyone who meets the following criteria. So that's one, they did not file taxes in 2018 or 2019. They had that gross income that didn't exceed 12,200 or 24,400 for married, and not otherwise required to file. So those people, again, if you don't receive Social Security, SSDI, railroad, retirement, and didn't file, this is where you go. And the requirements there to provide that information are very basic, just your social and your income. So what happens if you were eligible, you're not eligible for the EIP in 2018 or 2019, but you became eligible in 2020? The bad news is that they have no way of knowing that you were eligible yet, because 2020 isn't over yet, although I know many of us wish it were, that they will be a future process sort of once you file your 2020 returns to reconcile the payments, and then they will pay you back what you were owed. So don't worry about that. If you actually end up being the case that in 2018, you only filed in 2018 and you made very little money then and were eligible or were otherwise eligible, and then in 2020 you won the lottery, got promoted, became a CEO, and made a huge amount of money that now no longer means you are no longer eligible, you don't have to overpay that. So that's going to be considered a mathematical or a clerical error. And if you get overpaid because you earned less in FY 18 or 19 than 20, and your EIP was larger than it should have been, don't stress, spend the money on the needs that you have. You don't have to repay it. Okay, other important things to note is that payments are non-taxable income. And again, EIP payments are not loans. They don't need to be paid back to the government. You just get them and they're yours. Okay, other important things to note for folks, EIP recovery rebates that are not counted as income for the purposes of determining eligibility for federal means tested public benefits. So that means Medicaid, TANF, SNAP, food stamps. You don't have to worry that because you got a check for $1,200 that suddenly you're going to be tipped over income eligibility. It is important for folks to remember that unemployment insurance benefits are included in that person's adjusted gross income. So if you lost your job, unfortunately, due to the economic crisis, you will have to report your UI benefits. Other important things to note, tax rebates are not considered for public charge purposes. So there's no consideration of these for the public charge test. And I think that's a really important thing to know. I think a lot of people are very confused. The other thing to note is that if you need help with your taxes, and this is a little bit complicated because these are all in-person sites. There are two services, one, VITA sites, or volunteer income tax assistance programs that provide free help for taxpayers, and then tax counseling for the elderly, or TCE centers. You can either call 1-800-906-9887 or go to irs.treasury.gov/free tax prep. They're trying to figure out how to move these services online. Okay, so long story short, I'm going to move to food and nutrition because I've gone over, and I apologize for the technical difficulties, is that the virus does not exclude anyone based on immigration status, and no relief bills should do so. That it was outrageous that the CARES Act required Social Security numbers. Again, the virus does not require a Social Security number to infect someone, and that immigrant taxpayers pay taxes like anyone else, and this is deeply unfair. And we all know that if people are not excluded from these economic benefits, that they're going to have no choice but to go out to work even if they're sick. So we know that the best way to fight this epidemic and to ensure that all of us are healthier physically and economically is to include everyone in relief. So our big ask to Congress is to fix this terrible exclusion in COVID 4.0 or 3.5 in the next tax bill by removing the Social Security number requirement for the EIP. Okay, so that is taxes. Now I'm going to just talk about food and nutrition programs and then hand it over to the next presenter. So obviously many people may be newly eligible for Supplemental Food and Nutrition Program, or SNAP, now that they are earning less income. And it's important to know, again, that SNAP is generally only for what they call qualified immigrants. So that's a U.S. citizen or a green card holder who has been in the United States for 5 years or longer. also for children who are qualified as well, and refugees, people granted asylum, and other categories listed here. So again, SNAP has immigration status requirements, and it also requires you to have been here in the country for more than 5 years. But there are other programs if you're not eligible for SNAP. Those include food pantries, commodities and meal sites, the child nutrition program, school meals, and the Women, Infants, and Children program. These are programs that anyone can access when they're suffering during this terrible economic crisis, even regardless of their immigration status. Another thing to note is that one of the options that we have right now is pandemic EBT. So PEBT is a nutritional resources for families who are losing access to free and reduced price school meals because schools are closed because of COVID-19. The way it works is you get an EBT card that provides, has the value of the free school breakfasts and lunches for the days that schools are closed. The schools have to be closed for at least 5 consecutive days in order to get one. And again, eligible households are anyone whose children are certified to receive school meals, including those that are immigrants. There are no immigration restriction requirements. I'm not going to get too into the weeds here, but I'd love to talk about this with folks in general, which is that states have to issue a plan. They have to submit a plan about how they are going to operate PEBT. And this is going to be especially hard for immigrant families because let's say you're not eligible for many families whose kids are receiving school meals already have EBT cards. So they can just load the PEBT value onto the existing EBT card. But if you're an undocumented immigrant or otherwise ineligible, you're not going to have an EBT card. So they're going to have to figure out some way to send EBT cards to immigrants and convince them that it's safe to use. So states really need to be working. Only a handful of states have submitted plans so far. And for this to work, they have to submit a plan. So we really need to urge our states to get those plans out and make sure that they address immigrant needs and concerns. One more final piece is just the last thing is disaster SNAP. DSNAP provides replacement benefits for SNAP households and also extends benefits to others, including folks who are ineligible for SNAP for immigration status reasons. And so, DSNAP is going to be another important option that immigrants are going to hopefully be eligible, for, and we need to figure out ways to make that accessible to immigrants. Final note is just public charge, which is, so in terms of SNAP, most people who are eligible for SNAP are actually not subject to public charge. Folks know public charge is a test that happens when you apply to get a visa to enter the U.S. or to apply to get a green card. Use of SNAP doesn't automatically make you a public charge. So if you lost your job and now are using SNAP, that doesn't mean that you're automatically not going to be able to get a green card. They do not count the use of SNAP by family members. So if you have a dad, for example, that's applying for a green card and the kid is eligible for SNAP and is using it, that child's use of SNAP is not going to be counted against that father for their green card public charge test. And again, as a reminder, the following programs are not part of the public charge test. So food pantries, commodities and meal sites, child nutrition programs, school meals, after school snacks, summer meals, WIC, DSNAP, and PEBT. So there are food options and nutrition options for families, even if they are ineligible for SNAP. And no one should really be going hungry during the COVID-19 epidemic. We really want to also urge Congress to eliminate immigration status restrictions, stop proposed SNAP rules that would cut benefits or eligibility, and we really want Congress to expand SNAP relief in various ways, and we'll be continuing to advocate for that. So that is it on my part, and I will pass it to the next presenter.
Jackie, thank you so much. And I just want to thank all of our folks who've joined us today for your patience with the technology issues. Hopefully it'll be a little smoother. Also got no fewer than 30 questions during Jackie's presentation. So we'll try to get to as many of those as possible in the Q&A. So thanks so much, Jackie, again, for that really important information. I want to now move to our next presenter. We've got Sara Cullinane, who's the director at Make the Road, New Jersey. Sara, if you can unmute yourself, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who's participating today. My name is Sara Cullinane. I'm the director of Make the Road New Jersey. We're a grassroots immigrant and workers' rights organization, and there's my contact info. Please reach out and please follow us on social. So today I'm going to talk about what states can do to fill in for the real sort of lack of support for immigrants that came out of stimulus stimulus 3. So you can go to the next slide. So, our organization comes to this fight, we're a membership-based organization. Our members are continuing to work on the front lines of the COVID crisis, doing deliveries, working in warehouses, and they're doing the incredibly hard work that's really needed so that everyone else can, socially distance and stay home. And what's been incredibly devastating is just that the sort of lack of choice and the lack of support. So we're seeing members, for example, continue to work in unsafe conditions because they're ineligible for unemployment benefits because they're undocumented. Members continuing to work and not be able to care for a family member because they haven't been able to access the federal stimulus. So there's really real challenges. And so, we started organizing around this issue over the past couple of weeks as our members have, been now in the third or fourth week without income or are getting sick at work. Today I want to talk a little bit about some of the ideas we have. Just to be clear, New Jersey hasn't passed any laws. There aren't any, we don't have legislation that's even been proposed yet, but I'll talk you through some of the examples that we're thinking through in the hopes that it will help other people in other states as they're sort of stepping up to figure out how to address this crisis and how undocumented immigrants can be protected and access income and other relief. So, I share this page just to show some of the organizing work that we've been doing with our members and other partners, and feel free to check out these links to, if they're helpful in your own organizing. You can go on to the next slide. So, state level options. So there are some states that have taken action, notably California yesterday. And, there are about 15 or 20 different, maybe more today, different cities and counties that have stepped up to create options for undocumented people, whether it's income relief or income sort of cash payments or, rental assistance. And so, in New Jersey, we've been thinking about a couple of different and pushing a couple different options. And today I'll talk through three of them and sort of some of our thinking. The first is, as undocumented immigrants are excluded from stimulus payments, or rather ITIN filers are excluded from stimulus payments, can the state step up to create stimulus payments or, direct cash assistance? The next I'll talk about is creating a disaster relief fund that undocumented people can be eligible for at the state level. And then EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit for ITIN filers, which is a sort of longstanding idea. Immigrants have been pushing for this for a while. There are some open and active campaigns. There may be an opportunity to push this idea now. And those are just three ideas. There are so many more ideas, and I think this is a moment to really think creatively, think outside the box. But I'll take them one by one, and you can go to the next slide. So the first idea we've been thinking about is stimulus payments for excluded workers. So the idea here would be, through the state treasury, looking at people, immigrants who filed ITIN, through an ITIN, have filed taxes in the past, to use that same system to grant payments to undocumented workers who haven't been able to get the stimulus through the federal government. And in New Jersey, we think this would cost about $200 million to give the stimulus payment to each, as it would at the federal level. And, just as a data point, we were able to sort of make that calculation based on some data from ITEP, and I can, share that with others, or folks should visit their website if you want to learn about ITIN filers in your own state. And the advantage we saw here was, it eliminates a lot of the screening for, an application process. It's not about proving that you have suffered, or that you have lost wages, or, it's just undocumented workers as other workers and, other people paying taxes, ITIN filers, deserve this payment, and it's sort of a simple way, sort of seamless way to transfer income. It wouldn't necessarily require an application process. A disadvantage is that not everyone who's undocumented has an ITIN or files and through an ITIN, and that may mean that it leaves out large swaths of the population. And so I think, and the other thing is we know that every state tax system is different, and there can be some challenges to creating the sort of rebate or stimulus or payment to ITIN filers, so it may take some time. But this is one idea we've been thinking about. The next idea is thinking about a disaster relief fund. So we had drafted some legislation that would create a disaster relief fund for people who have lost work, and it would be $600 per week to individuals who've lost employment due to COVID and are ineligible for unemployment insurance. And we anticipate this would cost about $260 million for just 8 weeks. So that was sort of a rough calculation that we made. Of course, the crisis will go on longer than this, and we anticipate it would be much longer. And I think there are some real questions here when you think about disaster relief funds. So on the one hand, it creates a program that's sort of similar to unemployment, and sets it up in a parallel way for undocumented people, which is great. But there's sort of a question of, where is the best place to administer this? Many states are considering, and counties and cities are considering taking funds from, using a sort of public fund and then dispersing the funds to nonprofit organizations to give out the assistance and relief. And that has some advantages because it may, people may be more comfortable coming forward to nonprofits to give information, and also because many state agencies, including departments of labor that may be sort of fit to administer this program, are so overwhelmed with unemployment insurance processing and application processing. There's also, of course, the privacy issue of undocumented immigrants coming forward to present information to the state. So I think that's one question: sort of what is the best. And so you may want to consider, if you're designing a disaster relief program, speaking with different agencies across your state, which ones may have more bandwidth to administer this type of program. Maybe it's an agency that administers to children and families, or social services that may be more equipped at this moment. And I think, of course, there are a lot of questions to think through about, what is the type of documentation that you're asking people to provide in terms of lost wages? Is there any employer follow-up, and sort of what are the complications that could sort of present? I know I'm posing more questions than I'm answering, but I think this is just sort of some of our thinking. And you can go on to the next slide, please. The next idea is the earned income tax credit for ITIN filers, and I know that the next speaker will also be talking about this idea, so I'll be brief here. But here the idea was, and we actually have a proposal in our legislature right now. The idea is to expand earned income tax credit to people who file taxes with an ITIN. And New Jersey actually has its own EITC. New Jersey has a state EITC as well. That's not the case for many states, so this may not be an option for your state. And the idea here is that you can give direct cash assistance to undocumented people who file taxes through an ITIN and their families. The cost would be a bit less, about $54 million. The drawback is that it's actually not a lot of money. It's only about $288 for single people. That's the average EITC, and about $1,200 for a family. And also the money may come too late. Our tax season is now pushed back till the deadline is July 15th, so the funds may not come out until too late. One advantage of establishing a program like this is that it could create a benefit that extends beyond COVID by creating this new tax program that's, that undocumented people, ITIN filers, are eligible for a new tax rebate. So I'll just say in New Jersey, there's been a really key question that we've been grappling with, which is, when we approach the state about creating these funds, the big question is, well, how can we pay for this? And not every state is the same in this respect. But New Jersey is in a sort of major budget crisis, and many states are now, entering into a major budget crisis with state revenue plunging, given the pandemic. And so a lot of our thinking has been around, well, how can the state fund this, and what are some creative opportunities? We know that state dollars are the best and the most flexible, given concerns around, restrictions around federal funding. And so we've been thinking about creative ways to either free up state funds or to find federal funds that may not have restrictions. So you can go on to the next slide. So I'll just talk through a few of these options. So we've been thinking about federal dollars. So, there is an argument to be made that some of the CARES Act funding, used the state and local funds that were distributed through the CARES Act, may be used for states to administer programs for undocumented people. And so one idea is to push for more flexible funding in Stimulus 4, to ask your members of Congress, your congressional delegation, to try to push for more flexible dollars, either through this, the states and local fund, sort of earmarked funds, or otherwise, that may not have the same restrictions that other federal dollars do in terms of giving out, funding for undocumented people. So that's one idea, and an idea there is to engage both your members of Congress and your state legislators and executives to be pushing on that issue. Another option for states to free up funding, and you can go on to the next slide, is bonds. So states may issue general obligation bonds, which allow them to borrow for revenue purposes. And it's important if your state is going to get that a bond issued, that you argue that disaster relief and cash assistance is within the scope of permissible uses of funds. That's another option. Next slide. This is a new idea, new option. The Federal Reserve just committed to direct lending of up to $500 billion to state and local governments, it's done by authorizing the regional Federal Reserve banks to purchase state and local debt up to 1/5 of each jurisdiction's 2017 revenue. Anyways, it's an opportunity and it could provide states and localities with significant support, mainly states. It's only very large cities that are eligible for this. It's unclear whether states could use this funding directly for undocumented people, or whether it's just to set up a fund for undocumented people rather, or whether it may just be additional funds that a state could have and would then free up state dollars to use for this program. And I've added some more details there. You can go on to the next slide. Next option, the best option, tax the rich. There's proposals, I think, percolating in New York to tax billionaires to create a fund for workers, thinking about taxing corporations that are actually thriving in this moment, where we're in a pandemic, where most companies are shutting down. There's others that are thriving, like Amazon, corporations that are doing groceries or delivery, or so creating some type of state funding mechanism where you're generating revenue through taxation, through progressive taxation. Next slide. Then, of course, there's the public-private options. And I think, we put this one last because, I think private philanthropy has an incredible role to play in this pandemic, and states and public dollars, taxpayer dollars, should be used to support undocumented immigrants who are contributing so much in taxes and to this country. And it's sort of an equity issue. But I think, we're seeing a lot of the options popping up and some of the successful programs popping up that are public-private partnerships. I think one concern here is is it scalable? Will you be able to actually, provide sufficient relief through private options? But of course, yes, that's sort of an ongoing question. And next slide. I wanted to just share some other resources I think are helpful. A great new report on New York City and the number of undocumented people that are impacted by COVID, and on the sort of the impact on the workforce. And I also recommend folks looking at the ITEP data on ITIN filers when you're sort of creating your arguments. One thing I forgot to mention is the question of public charge. So some of the reasons we designed some of these proposals as we did was to avoid public charge issues. So our sense is that if you create short-term disaster relief, then it wouldn't be included in any public charge analysis, and it's a way to get cash assistance to undocumented people. Programs that seem more long-term, that are means tested, may trigger public charge issues, and similarly, an unemployment-like program may not trigger public charge. So that was another sort of part of our consideration. So I will stop there. You can go to the last slide. I'll just share again my contact information. Please check out our digital campaign called I Am Essential that we're doing with a bunch of different partner organizations in New Jersey, helping to lift up the stories of undocumented people and why, and U.S. citizen kids of undocumented people, and why they must be included in relief efforts. So yeah, thank you so much, and looking forward to continuing this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sara. Folks can see on the slide, we also have contact information for all the speakers. So in addition to putting questions into the chat, the question box, presenters are sharing their information if you want to follow up with more detailed questions as well. So thanks again, Sara. Our next speaker is Gabriela Ibañez Guzmán, who's a staff attorney at Somos and Pueblo Unido in New Mexico. So Gabby, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. This is Gabriela from Somos. So Somos is a 25-year-old organization. We were born in Santa Fe, New Mexico, but we are a membership-based immigrant workers civil rights organization. We have members across the state. Our members work in service, in hospitality, in oil and gas industry, in the agricultural dairy industry, and also in construction, along with a host of other industries, but those are the big ones. Super happy to be part of this webinar. We have a long-standing relationship with Milk. Lots of support from Milk throughout the years, including when we passed our driver's license access law back in 2003. And so when our governor issued our stay-at-home order back around March 13th, we began to brainstorm with our allies on how we can push our state to extend a lifeline to our familias, because we had a sinking suspicion in how the conversations were going nationally that members of our families, of our mixed status families, would be excluded. And so within our, informal or formal coalition were other immigrants' rights and workers' rights organizations, but also policy, think tank organizations. Specifically, I'll mention New Mexico Voices for Children, because I know that other states have Voices for Children organizations within their state, and they provide incredible numbers, great research, and in New Mexico, luckily enough, the executive director is a former state budget director, and so he was able to guide us with laser focus in terms of where we should be looking in our state statutes in terms of pre-existing programs, pre-existing revenue streams within the state system that could provide a more long-term approach to addressing this issue, because as we know, this is not going to be our first round with COVID-19. We're probably going to be cycling through this, unfortunately, at least for another year, and maybe even for an additional 2 years. And so we focused on looking at our public assistance statutes. Specifically, we looked at at the guidance of the executive director at New Mexico Voices, we found something within our public assistance statutes that's referred to. It's called the General Assistance Program. And, oh, I'm sorry, next slide. So here is our General Assistance Program statute. I mean, just to give you guys an idea what some of the statutory language might look like. And this program basically serves as a bridge for folks who are applying to SSI or other federal assistance, and there's that wait period where they're not receiving any help from the federal government, and so the state steps in with a little bit of cash assistance. And as you can see, we focused on subsection 3 because it seems to give the states some leeway in terms of organizing their general assistance program. But there's one huge caveat in terms of some of these public assistance, general assistance program, because, next slide, some of you might be aware, some of us were in middle school or in high school when this passed. I'm referring to the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act, the so-called Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act of 1996, or what some of us refer to as POWARA. So POWARA was really a full frontal attack in terms of low-income and immigrant folks being able to access public assistance programs. And it presents a stumbling block because within the federal provision, there are several limitations on providing public benefits to undocumented immigrants specifically. So a key provision of the federal act is codified in 8 USC 1621 subsection D, and as you can read from the language, the federal government is basically telling the states, okay, if you want to provide public assistance to undocumented immigrants living within your state, you must pass legislation that affirmatively does so, because it has the federal government directing states on what it can do. If you want to sidestep that legal argument for the moment and just make the statute adhere to 1621, there's always the possibility of adding language such as regardless of immigration status or something similar to your provision, your cash assistance or general assistance statute, in order to make the state statute conform to this federal requirement. However, we acknowledge, we're also politically aware, we acknowledge that adding undocumented immigrants to a public assistance statute is potentially politically fraught, maybe more likely, more possible during the COVID era, because it's becoming clearer and clearer who is being left out of our country's safety net. And so it's not just harming vulnerable adults, it's really harming vulnerable children again. And I would plug NILC as a great resource in terms of figuring out what might be the best language or the best way to move something like this forward within your legislation and within your legislature. So just a note on timeline. So New Mexico, unlike New Jersey, is a very small state. We are broke like New Jersey, though, but we are very dependent on oil and gas for our revenue, and our state coffers are quickly depleting. And so normally our state meets once a year, our legislature meets once a year in January, and depending on the particular year, we either meet for 30 days or 60 days, which is kind of crazy that we get all of the state's business done in either 30 or 60 days. There is the option of calling a special session, and we are likely to have a special session before the end of this fiscal year, because as Sara also alluded to, we are facing a crunch in terms of our state budget. We will have to go into special session most likely to cut back on raises that were approved in February for state employees because we simply just don't have the money. Oil and gas production is way down. There is a fight over OPEC oil prices, and that is impacting our state severely. And so that is why we are looking at doing private and state dollar leveraging, because we did the rough estimate that there's about 50,000 undocumented immigrants in New Mexico. And so what would it cost to give them some form of economic relief that is direly needed right now? And so we estimated we would need about 1.7 million. So if we could get half of that from the state and perhaps collectively do some sort of private fundraising with a statewide foundation or a couple of foundations across New Mexico to create some sort of leverage, and also to assist the state right now in a time where we're broke. And we're broke at the same time that people are very much in need. And so, as I mentioned before, we are very politically aware, and is part of the reason why we've been able to pass some pretty critical legislation here in New Mexico. We recognize that we have to work in coalition. We have to have very compelling and tailored and strategic messaging to be able to pass these sort of legislative proposals. And next slide. So I don't know, Avideh mentioned that innovative ideas. I don't know how innovative it is for New Mexico to try to include ITIN filers within our state equivalent of the earned income tax credit, but because a number of states are also trying to do that. So we proposed this during our most recent legislative session. We were able to get past the New Mexico House, and we had a harder time. We did not get heard in the New Mexico Senate. It's much more conservative than the New Mexico House, but we know because of our long track record that sometimes it takes multiple shots at the basket to be able to make that shot in terms of getting this legislation passed. And so here's some history that Jackie already provided in terms of the earned income credit. Some pluses about the earned income credit EITC is that it has a long track record. It shows that it incentivizes work, and it really helps lift families out of poverty. There's the larger economic benefit because those families put that money right back into the community, right back into the economy. And also, I know a lot of us are workers' rights, immigrants' rights organizations, and while it might not be the natural connections, improving state policy, state tax policy really is equivalent to a civil rights issue, and making our economy and our communities more just, because it benefits low-income children, low-income families, regardless of where their parents may have been born. So, for example, currently a family of four who earns about $56,000 would benefit, their earned income credit benefit would either be somewhere between $11 to $6,500. Next slide, please. So our equivalent in New Mexico is called the Working Families Tax Credit. And it specifically mentions the EITC right there, section 32 of the IRS code. And our proposal that again passed the New Mexico House was just to include a line that stated a taxpayer who is a resident and files an individual New Mexico tax return may claim this credit. So it can be as simple as that, to add in a whole community within your tax policy. And the other proposal that we have going in terms of tax policy is, next slide please, is amending another tax program that we have for low-income individuals in New Mexico, and I would assume that a number of states have something equivalent of New Mexico's low-income comprehensive tax rebate. And so this is very much targeted towards the working poor. We refer to this as LICTR. And the beauty of LICTR is that it already includes ITIN filers because, again, the statute just references any resident who files an individual New Mexico income tax return is eligible for this benefit. The issue with LICTR, even though it was enacted in New Mexico in the 1970s, is that the income brackets have not been updated since 1998, which is mind-boggling. And so our proposal would be to add an indexing component to keep up with inflation and really reflect the realities of working families living in our states. And so, for example, if the New Mexico legislature were to allow for the indexing, families who earn $34,000 or less would be also eligible for this tax rebate. And next slide, please. So here's my contact information. While none of the proposals that Somos presented today really address the immediate need, we are trying to take the long view during this particular crisis because, as we mentioned previously, this isn't going to be the first time around in terms of stay-at-home orders. We're just assuming this as well, that our families are going to need a lifeline, perhaps a permanent lifeline, to provide some sort of economic relief as we deal with this particular crisis. And that's my presentation. Please feel free to reach out, call, email, text. I'd love to talk to other people from other states to see what they're doing.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. We could just go to the next slide. I wanted to, before I jump into a brief presentation on what's next at the federal level, I just wanted to let folks know you've heard about the incredible work that's happening at the state and local level. And it's going to be really crucial, not just in the short term, but really going forward, as folks have said, in filling in these really crucial gaps for community members. So for those who are willing and able, NILC has set up a COVID-19 response fund. You can donate as little as $5 or even less. It all adds up, and all of the proceeds for that fund go directly to local grassroots organizations to support the kinds of COVID-19 responses you've been hearing about from our partners at the state level and local organizations as well around the country. So just wanted to make a quick plug for that. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. Okay, so what's next at the federal level? What is Congress up to? If we could go to the next slide quickly, please. Thank you. So as folks have mentioned, the two bills, the 2.0 and 3.0 COVID-19 relief bills, the Families First Act and CARES Act, they were a significant start. This webinar is obviously focused on the tremendous gaps. But we do recognize that there were important provisions that were included in those bills. They just simply don't go nearly far enough. And there's kind of been this battle, honestly, between Republicans and Democrats about, I think Republicans prefer to try to quickly as possible resume whatever their version of, business as usual is. And we're seeing some push and pull between the parties where, Democrats are more interested and have more of an appetite in trying to take on, much bigger legislation. Right now, they are kind of at a standstill. They're trying to push through the next round of a relief bill. Some folks are referring to it as the 3.5 bill or an interim relief bill. You may know that funding and economic supports for small businesses has essentially dried up. And there's a sense of urgency around ensuring that small businesses have the ability to survive and continue to employ people and resume their work when we get past the worst of this pandemic. Unfortunately, that's at a bit of a standstill. Republicans wanted this next interim bill to just focus on small business relief, whereas Democrats are trying to include money for hospitals and state and local governments and to be a little bit broader. Next slide, please. Thank you. So a lot of the issues we've talked about today are not anticipated to get taken up in that interim bill. It's really the next phase, the 4.0 relief package. Some folks are referring to that as the CARES 2.0. That will see a lot of these issues that are being discussed in play, and where there will hopefully be more room to finally redress the gaps that have been described today and in the webinars we've been doing this week. And so that is really, the timing of that is really unclear. There is now a prolonged recess for Congress. Both members of the House of Representatives and the Senate are in recess until May 4th. They just extended that in recent days. It's entirely possible that they extend that again. And what that means is it doesn't mean that they're not, at work and not actively negotiating or considering negotiations around what would be included in these 3.5 and 4.0 relief bills. But it does mean in order to vote for anything on anything, it has to be unanimous. Otherwise, they need to all be physically back here and doing votes per the rules of Congress. And that's really hard to get them to do that right now. They're having trouble agreeing. There was a lot more pressure in the build-up to the CARES Act, because there hadn't yet been any relief bill that had passed that would include a lot of the economic measures that were sort of a first step. So it's really hard to know what the timing is going to look like, but we are obviously have been actively lobbying Congress for the past few weeks, and we'll continue to do that. It just may be that we are looking at something more like early to mid-May before there's actually the next kind of big relief package. Next slide, please. And so I won't go into all of these because some of them are outside the scope of this particular presentation, but we've been doing a series of webinars and just wanted, and you'll see reflected in a lot of the NILC resources that I'll highlight for you before we go into the Q&A, that, it's a really important thing for everyone to take action, to take a minute to call your member of Congress. They are not, they and their staff are not physically there right now, but that doesn't mean that they're not registering communications that they're getting from their constituents. So it's really key to call wherever you live, call your own House representative and your own 2 senators, unless you're in Washington, D.C., but for everyone else. And the key things, particularly those that have been highlighted on today's call, include expanding immigrant access to rebates, as you've heard, by removing the Social Security number requirement, making sure that there's treatment and testing, treatment, and vaccines when they become available for everyone, regardless of their immigration status, and ensuring that these gaps in healthcare are addressed and covered under emergency Medicaid, stopping the public charge rule, the implementation of the public charge rule that Jackie mentioned in her presentation. And, I just saw actually while we've been talking today that there was a release of all these reports of, poor and dangerous working conditions for people. So it's really key to make sure that we are doing more to protect particularly frontline workers, including keeping our immigrant community members in as stable a position as possible so that they have continuous status and work authorization. So there's other things in here that I've included just in the slide for you to take a look at. Some of them, again, go beyond the scope of this particular webinar, but are just good to have on your radar as you're engaging with members of Congress. And again, our materials go into more of what these different priorities mean and why they're important. We could go to the next slide, please. Great. So as I mentioned, there's a number of different resources that we are happy to make available to you. Here are just a couple. There's one on our messaging guidance for when you're trying to talk about these issues within your community. And there's also an issue brief that NILC put out a couple weeks ago that really highlights in detail the provisions we talked about on today's webinar, but also many other key provisions that are part of the COVID-19 relief bills that have been passed to date, and specifically their impact on immigrant communities, in particular with respect to access to economic supports and healthcare and benefits. We also have a number of other resources on our website, including a very detailed FAQ on immigrant workers and other materials that are going to be forthcoming. And I know we are happy to share those. So for folks who have particular questions, don't hesitate to follow up. And as a reminder, anyone who registered for today's webinar will get a copy of these slides and the links to these resources as well. I'm going to move us to the next slide and use the remaining time that we have today to begin the Q&A. Folks have very actively engaged in the question box, which is awesome. It helps us try to consolidate the many questions that we've gotten. So feel free to continue to use those. If we don't get to all your questions, again, feel free to save them and ask the panelists after the webinar is over. But let me just start with some of the ones that we've been receiving. Jackie, I'm going to start with you. I have some questions around clarifying your information. And this one came up a couple times. If you're able to clarify what happens with the cash stimulus payments for a household where one spouse has a Social Security number and the other spouse is undocumented, are they eligible for the stimulus payments, or what is the impact of the CARES Act on that family?
Great. So that is the challenging question. So the way that the bill is written is that it requires, if there is a couple and they are filing jointly, and one of them has a social and the other has an ITIN, then no one in the household can get the rebate. For joint filers, both filers have to have, who are married filing jointly, have to have valid Social Security numbers. If there are two parents, two married filing jointly, taxpayers who both have ITINs, even if their children have Social Security numbers, no one in the household can get the rebate. Again, very punitive. One exception to the previous one, again, only if there is if you have a mixed status where one person has a social, the other one has an ITIN, and someone was in the armed forces, then yes, you can claim it. That's the one exception. So what happens if you have two filers with Social Security numbers? Some of their kids have ITINs, the other kids have Social Security numbers. They will only get the $500 credit for the children that have Social Security numbers that are valid. A few other just kind of things that people asked a little bit sort of about the issue of kids. The definition of kids is the tax definition of qualifying child for tax credits. So that at the end of the filing year, the child has to have been younger than the tax filer and younger than 19, or that kid has to be younger, youth has to be younger than 24 and a full-time.
Speaking, if you could please mute yourself. Thank you.
So basically, long story short, if the kid has to be either claimed as a dependent on the return. To be eligible, they again have to be younger than 19 or younger than 24 and be a full-time student, or be any age and permanently and totally disabled. And that's their terminology. And the child has to have the same main home as you or your spouse in the United States for more than half the year. And again, they can only be claimed by one person. So one of the things I've been asked a lot about is what happens, and as a reminder, if you have DACA or TPS, you have a social security number and you have work authorization, therefore you are eligible for the economic impact payment. I think there's a lot of confusion about the fact that people with DACA and TPS are eligible as long as they have work authorization and a valid social. And so one of the questions that comes up is, well, what if both parents are undocumented and the youth has DACA? Well, again, in that case, the parents would both have ITINs and therefore the whole household is ineligible. If the person has DACA and they are a child, they have to file on their own tax return in order to be eligible for the economic impact payment. And the last question that I'm getting asked a lot about is, what if I have a valid social security number, but don't have work authorization, or I had work authorization and it's expired? The law says that you have to have not just a valid social, but also a valid social with work authorization. However, in many cases, you might have had a situation where you had a valid social and you had work authorization in 2018, but that work authorization has expired. And so they are going to be estimating your payments based on the fact your 2018 returns, if that's the last year you filed. We don't know the full answers to this yet. Our current analysis is that, that person's probably going to get a return, and we've heard some situations where that has already happened. And we do not think that they should have to pay them back or suffer any consequences for them, that it'll be treated like a clerical error. But it's very complicated because we also just don't know how the IRS determines whether or not you have a social security number and work authorization. We already have indicators right now that there's some confusion about how they're treating these issues. But so the long story short is, technically you are supposed to have work authorization in order to get the credit the way the law is written. But we are hearing that some people might be getting it even if they don't. The social security number is the main thing. We don't think it's going to be a problem, but stay tuned. We'll update folks as soon as we know more.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And I know there's some questions too, just generally around like ITINs and how many people file with ITINs and things of that nature. We do have separate resources at NILC specifically on that. And as I mentioned before, our resource that gives sort of the issue brief and overview of the different provisions in the Families First and CARES Act goes into more detail in terms of what Jackie's been talking about. So hopefully it will answer any questions that folks that weren't addressed. Sara, I've got a question for you. So someone had asked about New Jersey passing emergency paid sick leave, something that would cover workers that includes undocumented workers. Can you clarify what New Jersey's been up to on that front?
Sure. So New Jersey has had a paid sick leave law on the books for the past 2 years that provides 5 days of sick leave for almost every worker. There's a couple of exemptions for per diem healthcare workers, I believe, but regardless of the size of the business and regardless of immigration status. So that law is in effect. There have been a couple of other expansions of workers' rights and protections since COVID, but the sort of baseline paid sick law has been predates COVID, so undocumented workers can use that as a benefit or as a right.
Thanks, Sara. And for Gabriela, we've got a question about how can folks in their states advocate within their states to pressure elected officials for PEBT and DSNAP?
Well, I think it's pretty clear from all the media reports that there is a big concern with food insecurity. Food pantries are just overwhelmed with the demand. And so incorporating that into your messaging campaign, I think makes a pretty compelling story that folks just plain don't have enough to eat. And I think Nelk also mentioned some of their, it's either a toolkit or some of their messaging tools that we have found to be very helpful. So definitely plug into those too. But it's just the reality right now is very distressing, but also very compelling.
Thanks so much, Gabriela. I realize we're just at time, and so many questions from so many of you. Super grateful for everyone's very active engagement this afternoon. We know these are complex issues, and we're hopeful that today's webinar helped address some of your questions and that the follow-up resources will be able to fill in more gaps as well. And I just wanted to say thank you to our excellent presenters, Jackie, Sara, Gabriela, and to Ignacia for organizing today's webinar. As you can see on this last slide, we've got contact information for everyone. So if there are particular questions that weren't specifically addressed or that you don't see addressed in any of the resources that we send out, please feel free to reach out to any of us. We'd be happy to respond to your questions. And we also hope this helps generate some ideas and thinking and energy around what can happen at the state and local level, while we're also fighting for Congress to, have nationwide policies that are consistent across the country and are immigrant inclusive, so we don't have to exclusively rely on states to fill in those gaps. So just want to thank everyone for their participation and their attention and for bearing with us through the technical difficulties. And thank you so much.